Introducing Veronica Masters and Holly Marone, and they're presenting the Combating the Pervasiveness of Mental Illness in the Dance World. So please join me and welcome them to the stage.
Hello, my name is Veronica Masters. I'm a senior dance pedagogy major with an exercise science minor.
And my name is Holly Marone, and I'm a double major in dance, performance, and choreography and philosophy.
And as Chad said, today we'll be presenting on combating the pervasiveness of mental illness in the dance world. So originally, we were able to present this information at the Florida Dance Educators Organization conference back in the fall. And it was really cool because Holly came to me with this topic, and she was like, I really want to research this. So I was like, okay, great, let's research. And so we started kind of digging into the topic, and we realized there's not a lot of research on this issue. We realized that most of the research is directed in treating dance as a solution to mental illness. And when we say mental illness, we're specifically referring to sort of invisible mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, PTSD, other sorts of just complicated diseases like that. We do want to specify that we are not addressing eating disorders as much in this presentation, because there is a lot of research on that, and that could be a whole presentation within itself. So we're focusing more on those other ones. So when we realized that a lot of the research was on dance therapy and dance as a solution, we asked ourselves, what happens when dance is the issue? What happens when dance is either the cause or the aggressor of a mental illness? You can't treat that with dance therapy. So how do we address that? And why is there less research in this area? So in our research, we largely focused on college-aged adults, which is about the 18 to 23 age range. And originally, we were presenting this to dance educators. So essentially, in this context, we kind of opened it up to not only dance educators, but other educators in any sort of classroom setting, especially in performance-based fields. So like coaches in athletics or music teachers, like that. So when we say dance educators, we're also kind of addressing those fields too. So basically, the conclusion we came to throughout our research is that to combat the pervasiveness of mental illness in the dance world, dance educators and other educators must be proactive about spreading awareness amongst colleagues and students, providing resources to support healing, and promoting self-care that encompasses both one's visible and invisible health. So we wanted to start by presenting the problem. How prevalent is this? We learned in our research that approximately 1 in 5 adults has a mental illness in the United States. And the college-aged adults, again, that 18 to 23 age bracket, have the highest occurrence and diagnosis. So clearly this is an issue, not just in the dance world, but in our world at large. We also learned that symptoms of mental illness show up as early as age 14. Now, in the dance world, age 14 is around the time that you start dancing seriously, and sometimes they're even considering careers at that age. For example, there's a ballet competition called the Youth Grand Prix where ballet companies are essentially recruiting teenagers. And so this is a huge issue at that age. There are a lot of risk factors for mental illness, some of which are beyond one's control, such as genetics, a chronic illness, some sort of head injury, or past emotional trauma. But there are also environmental factors which are controllable but can definitely build up. And so we noticed that in the 18 to 23 age bracket, there are a lot of life transitions, and this creates 2 environmental factors that can contribute to mental illness. And these are stressful life situations such as moving, getting a new job, having to deal with housing. I'm sure we all understand the stress that can come from that. And also having few friends. For instance, both Holly and I are students that are from out of state, so when we moved here, we didn't know anyone. And that can be extremely stressful too. So one of the studies we looked at by Ron Shore shows that university students with severe mental illness have difficulty completing academic tasks and engaging socially with their peers. So not only do they already come into college with this mental illness, but these factors compound on each other where they're not getting good grades because their mental illness is affecting their performance, and then because their performance is affected, that makes them feel worse, and so it just kind of snowballs. So how does this apply to dance? As far as these controllable environmental factors, dance is really an environment of perfectionism. I know we have a lot of dancers in here, and we all understand that essentially what we're trying to do is be perfect all the time. And so a negative psychological environment increases the chance of physical injury and mental unhealth. So when an educator is creating an environment of perfectionism and unrealistic standards, not only does it affect the student's mental and emotional well-being, especially if they already have a diagnosed mental illness or an undiagnosed one in some cases, it can also increase their chance of physical injury, which of course is not good for a dancer. One of the definitions that we read in the book Safe Dance Practices by Quinn and others is, quote, setting excessively high standards and being overly critical to the point of never being satisfied with yourself, unquote. And so clearly perfectionism is something that could be a good thing, but is often compounded into a bad thing. And so there was a study done by Hill and others where they interviewed collegiate and pre-professional people in athletics and dance and music, so essentially high-performing people in performance-based fields. And they found a connection between perfectionism, obsessiveness, and chronic dissatisfaction throughout their interviews. They were interviewing specifically self-identified perfectionists in these fields, and drive, accomplishment, and strain were the common themes that emerged in the interviews, with most participants identifying their perfectionism as having a negative impact on their mental, emotional, and physical well-being. So if most dancers are perfectionistic and they're put into a perfectionistic environment, what happens then when they also have a mental illness? And what can we as dance educators do to, first of all, recognize this problem and also try to combat it?
Throughout our research, we believe that the difference begins within the studio, and the role of the dance educator has the greatest influence of all because they're in the position of authority. Mental illness is, in general, a taboo subject. Dance educators who've studied this topic are then in a unique position to create an environment that promotes mental health care if they have an understanding and awareness themselves and are able to communicate that to their students and colleagues. Now, spreading awareness, information, and resources to students are the critical components of promoting mental health care. Now, what does this look like in the dance studio? Mental illness can be very difficult to understand due to the wide array of symptoms that manifest throughout all the different types of mental illnesses there are. Some can be concealed and hidden, and others cannot. For example, heavy breathing, shaking, and tears are possible symptoms of an anxiety attack, and it's very clear to see when somebody's having one. Whereas the symptoms of depression can be more easily concealed, however, they can't be concealed forever and will eventually manifest themselves in harmful ways. Now, as Ronnie mentioned, eating disorders are very prevalent within the dance field. I'm sure you guys have all seen movies or TV shows or read articles about how this type of mental illness is affecting dancers, and there's a lot of research done about that, but we wanted to focus more on those mental illnesses that have not been talked about, like depression and anxiety. So, in society in general, we know that dance has an amazing capability to spread awareness about mental illness, and that's because dance is a language of itself. It can communicate what words cannot. There's actually another presentation going on right now in the Rotunda about how dance is a language. And I mean, many of you guys are dancers, and you know how powerful this is. And it allows us to speak about things that are taboo and that we might not be able to communicate easily with words. So within the world of dance, the first step that needs to happen is dance educators who have the greatest opportunity to encourage healthy change to their influence over the next generation of dancers. So it's dance teacher first is basically what we have come to the conclusion of. So dance teachers can encourage healthy mental practices within their using their own understanding and awareness of mental illness. We ask dance educators to maintain a basic understanding of the physical nature of mental illness. Now, they don't have to be experts or start diagnosing people by any means, but just being aware of the symptoms the same way that they're aware of the symptoms of a flu or a sprained ankle. Now, all of this is very personal to me because I've experienced mental illness as a dancer myself. Last year, I was a freshman here, and I had flown all the way from Minnesota and gone through a big life transition, which was very stressful, to a place where I didn't know anybody at all. That combined with perfectionism and a long genetic history of mental illness in my family, of depression specifically, I found myself becoming a textbook case of this. Now, as a dancer, we go into the studio and we stare at ourselves for hours and hours on end in a mirror all day looking for imperfections. Clearly, that's not very good for one's mental health, especially when they're already struggling with depression as it is. Now, luckily, I was able to communicate to my teachers, and I had a very loving, supporting community of dancers and friends who were able to help me when I needed it, and to encourage me to go reach out to the resources that were available at PBA and available just around us in the community in general. Now, this was a very good case. Not all cases end up like this. Untreated depression can lead to self-destruction ultimately, which is why I think we need to be able to talk about this. And that's also why I'm not afraid to talk about it right now. It's just another problem, and it's something that we can all take steps to talk about. Open communication, talk about it, and encourage others to find healing. So dance educators can foster healthy mental practices by encouraging communication within the environment, educating themselves on symptoms and solutions, and sharing information and local resources with their dancers.
So essentially, how does open communication look? How can educators, coaches, dancers foster this environment of open communication that doesn't exacerbate mental illness by creating an environment of perfectionism? Something that we saw in our research from the book Safe Dance Practices by Del Quinn and others was that there are essentially three basic psychological needs that humans have, and that is a feeling of autonomy, a feeling of belonging, and a feeling of competency. And so essentially, we would argue that educators should foster an environment that supports these basic needs. So what is each one of these, and how do we foster that? Essentially, a feeling of autonomy can be broken down into the phrase voice and choice. It's essentially letting your students feel ownership of the subject and of their own learning process. So a good way to do that is to create dialogue and ownership is to allow and ask questions. So if you're allowing your students to raise their hand and ask a question in the middle of the class and you're receptive to that, or if you're asking them questions to engage in critical thinking, that creates a literal dialogue that they will then carry into outside of the classroom, where they feel that they can talk to you and they feel that when they talk to you, they will be heard. And it also can look like giving choices and variability. So something as simple as, okay, we're going to do this jump. You can either put your hands above your head or your arms to the side. Then they get to choose. They're exercising creativity, and they feel like they are owning their own dance experience, and they have a little bit of control. Of course, that doesn't mean let the student run the classroom, but just giving these little things in which they can make a choice and they can use their voice can be really helpful in meeting that basic psychological need of autonomy. The second is belonging, and this can also be called relatedness, and it's essentially connection to others and connection to whatever they're studying. So in this case, dance, or if it's soccer practice or it's music class. So basically, it creates a healthy group dynamic and it supports autonomy. So what this looks like is, first and foremost, not singling out students as your favorite or directly comparing one student to another in a negative way. You can foster this environment where everyone is friends with everyone and everyone's trying to support everyone by having them do work in small groups and changing up the groups, and even something as simple as like changing where everyone is in space within the room. So like, okay, if you're in the front line, let's switch to the back and let's switch the rows, go stand somewhere else, or today we're going to move the desks so that everybody's sitting next to someone new. This really creates that group dynamic where they can foster their own connections and their own friendships so that they have a support system, and it really involves them in the healing process. And then the last is a feeling of competency. We all want to feel like we're good at the things we do. And so this looks like giving your students appropriate challenges, not asking them to attain essentially perfection or something that's just not achievable for them right now. and having a balance of criticism and encouragement. What we aren't saying is to sacrifice your standards. We as dancers want the teachers that are going to push us, are going to give us criticism when we need it. We want a good, challenging class. So we're not saying to set aside your standard of excellence. We're just saying maybe change the way you communicate your standard of excellence to be a little more uplifting and a little less just tense and bringing things down. So that's essentially how you can encourage open communication in the classroom. But that communication does not stop inside the classroom. There's also things that, that teachers can do outside the classroom.
So some practical things for dance educators to do are to first grasp that basic understanding of mental illnesses that we've been talking about. And one great way to do that is to use the resource mayoclinic.org, which has a lot of information. So studying up, researching symptoms the same way you might research symptoms of a sprained ankle or the flu or something like that, and treating it like something that's just real and that we can just deal with if we need to deal with it. So we also encourage dance educators to look into the community and find different local healthcare professionals or facilities, and even establishing connections and open a communication with them. And we also suggest having dance educators invite a mental health care professional into the studio environment to speak to the dancers. As dancers, I think a lot of us have had a dietitian come in and speak about nutrition, how to take care of our bodies through fueling ourselves with healthy foods, or even a physical therapist who comes in and speaks about how to prevent injury and take care of injury. Well, we can talk about mental illness in the same way. So just even posting different informational resources like that on bulletin boards outside, and making sure that there's that open, safe communication with students to say that if you're having a problem, you can come up to me and we can talk about it. And encouraging that healthy, open environment is really the biggest thing. So in conclusion, Ronnie and I found that combating the pervasiveness of mental illness in the dance world begins with dance educators being proactive about spreading awareness among colleagues and students, providing resources to support healing, and promoting self-care that encompasses both one's visible and invisible health. Ronnie and I would like to open it up the floor right now for any questions that you guys might have.
How would you suggest a dance teacher or coach should bring this subject up with their students?
Just talking about it is a little bit intimidating. I'm sure that you guys can understand that because it is such a complex subject, but maybe starting the class off one day was just saying, hey everyone, I would like to talk to you guys about mental illness, and it's not something that anybody has to be ashamed of. And if any of you ever feel like you might be struggling with that, please come talk to me and I can get you the help that you need. The same way that a student might approach their dance teacher with some sort of different illness. If I'm not feeling well today, or I haven't been feeling well for a little while, you let your dance teacher know, and they provide a supporting and loving answer.
In your research, do you find students maybe switching majors because the mental illnesses are to bear, or do you think students just cope with it and deal with it and move on?
Yeah, so I think part of the difficulty is that a lot of our research didn't fully focus on dance, and we kind of had to find other ways of like things that were related, just because unfortunately there aren't a lot of direct statistics on this issue. But I know that I have heard personal testimonies from other dancers. I think about my sophomore year, we had a dancer come in and talk to us about how she had to quit dancing. In this case, it was an eating disorder, because she was literally like killing herself by just the perfectionism and the unhealthy environment. She was a ballerina, I believe. And so not only did she have the mental component, she also had the physical component. And it can cause people to quit altogether. And it's kind of heartbreaking to see that, because normally, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, because dance can be extremely healing and stuff. I've also had one of my past teachers has talked about how she kind of just transitioned from ballet into modern because she just couldn't take the perfectionism of ballet anymore. Modern's a lot more free-flowing and a lot more forgiving when it comes to technique, because ballet, if you don't have like the right body proportions, well, too bad, figure it out. But modern has a lot more give to it. So yeah, while I haven't seen necessarily a lot of research on it, I have definitely like seen it in dancers that I know where they'll quit altogether, or they'll hopefully just find a way to change that and reroute that energy into something a little more positive.
If a dance teacher suspects that a specific student has a mental illness, what is a sensitive way that they can talk to that student without being offensive or making it worse?
Because it is such a sensitive subject, I would definitely do it one-on-one. And depending on the type of relationship that the teacher has with the student, being very careful and knowing their boundaries. But of course, the teacher should not first imply that a student does have a mental illness, but ask the student how they're feeling and how they've been doing, and trying to get an honest and open answer from them. And if it is something where they're concerned for the student's safety, definitely talking to the parents as well would be the safest way to go.
When it comes to maybe like a group problem, when it comes to like bullying or someone not being perfect in the dance world, how would you deal with that as far as a mental illness? Because, you know, bullying can arise those feelings. Like, how would you deal with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely like something I think any educator deals with, and I think that's part of fostering that belonging in the group environment. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes as an educator, it can be very easy to be removed from the group dynamics of your class and to not realize that that stuff is going on. So I think some of the best things you can do is, again, just making sure you're approachable by any of your students, that they know that if there is an issue, they can come to you and you will take it seriously. But second, just ensuring that you're not doing anything to create that kind of bullying environment. So, you know, if I'm in class and I have Holly and Skylar in class, not saying like, well, Skylar, why isn't your leg as high as Holly's? You know, things like that, where you're directly comparing them and giving Holly an elevated feeling over Skylar to where she feels that, like, you know, a little bit of superiority or something. Instead, just like fostering like small groups, friendship, and making sure that when you see those behaviors, like, first of all, that you're not modeling them, and second of all, that you know, don't have a tolerance for them. And doing the best you can to be involved in your student's life appropriately, so that you do notice if those group dynamics are happening. Uh-huh. Yes.
Is there any way to make someone who's suffering from depression have a little bit of an easier time? Like if you're surrounded by someone who struggles with it, but you're not very close with them, how do you make their day a little better, easier? It's an absolute.
I think just approaching the situation from kindness first, and trying to understand. Of course, you might not understand completely if you haven't gone through it yourself, but understanding that what they're experiencing is really out of their hands. It's not something that they can control. And so maybe providing them an outlet to talk or just to express something is very helpful.
Yes.
A lot of what you guys talked about was specifically within like the college dance world. Do you have any testimonials or any? I mean, you said there was a lot of research on it, but how that affects dancers professionally?
Yeah, I think that one we didn't look into too much just because neither of us have danced professionally. But I think it's probably a lot of the same things. Like I said, sometimes kids are, I want to say the word drafted, that's not right, but drafted into a professional company when they're a teen. And so I think it's comparable to the transition between high school and college, because they're going from high school to all of a sudden an environment that has a lot higher expectations for them. And so I think sometimes I would, this is kind of conjecture at this point, but I would assume it's might even be worse because they dance a lot more than we do. We as dance majors here at PBA also have like, you know, our gen eds and stuff. So like it's not like there are some days where I spend like 6 hours dancing, but it's not consecutively and that's not the norm. And so we have the opportunity to get out of the studio and, you know, enrich our minds in other ways where they're like dedicated just to this one thing. So if I had to kind of guess, I would think it might be even worse just because they are spending like 6 hours a day rehearsing. They're being expected to keep up with the more advanced members of the company, and it's more of a competitive environment, whereas a university is more of a learning environment. Yes?
So you suggested there's a pervasiveness of mental illness in the dance world. Do you think that, you know, I don't know if you even have any numbers, is it worse now? Was it worse before? Do you think that even your approaches are maybe somehow context specific also, like appropriate for your generation but may not have been appropriate previously or in the future? Just sort of think about time.
Yeah, so we didn't do so much time research, but I know that like there were a lot of like really unhealthy dance practices throughout dance history because of the lack of like research. For instance, like, yeah, let's not eat all day. We'll just smoke to suppress our appetite, and that's probably healthy, you know? So like just really unhealthy things like that I would imagine in some ways, there was probably a lot more undiagnosed mental illness, just based on what I've learned in dance history. And I'm not sure how that would translate, just because you're right, in the past, this wouldn't have necessarily been the way that they would treat it. But I think as far as like kind of the solutions we've come up, I would like to be optimistic and say that they are timeless. Because they come out of a place of like support and love and like that kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm not sure. It would be certainly interesting to extend the research into the past to see what methods were back then, and then to kind of see how that's going to play out in the future. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you guys for coming. If you have any other questions, we'll be here, so thank you.